Hello. We're going to take a look at a argument posted by my dear friend, which is Ali Martinez R1. He's probably the best philosopher on Twitter at the moment. If you want to learn about philosophy, theology and logic, just follow him. Trust me, it's brilliant. So the argument he posted it's a ontological argument by Peter Kreeft. So it's obviously regarding the existence of God. So this is the actual Twitter argument itself. I initially replied with just text explaining how it parses logically and how it's valid. I think a lot of people have some questions about just what it means. So I thought it might be easier to explain just in a video basically. So here we go. So the argument itself, it's a pretty standard ontological argument. So the expression that being than which is greater cannot be thought, or GCB for short, expresses a consistent concept. So GCB being greatest conceivable being, it's the idea that whatever you can conceive in your mind as the greatest conceivable being, it will always be greater in real life, because your mind simply can't conceive the greatest being. It's simply a conception inside your mind and the limitations of your mind. Number two, GCB cannot be thought of as A, necessarily non-existent, or as B, contingently existing, but only as C, necessarily existing. Number three, so GCB can only be thought of as the kind of being that cannot not exist, that must exist. This one sounds confusing, but I will explain it later, and it does make sense. 4, but what must be so is so. And then number 5, the conclusion, therefore GCB, i.e. God, exists. So in order to parse the entire argument into modal predicate logic, the first thing I did was identify the variables, the components. So we've got G, greatest conceivable being; T, greater cannot be thought, or greater than what can be thought. We've got C, consistent concept; N, necessarily existing; and finally E, exists. That's pretty straightforward. So the first line, first premise, the expression that being than which is greater cannot be thought, GCB for short, expresses a consistent concept. So the way I parse it into logic is I'm using some operators. I'm using necessary because, well, God is necessary rather than consistent. Sorry, contingent. So it's not a possibility. We're saying that it has to be a necessary. I mean, if God does not exist necessarily, then God is not God. And using the universal quantifier for all, because if we're saying for all God, I mean, if God is contingent, if God is not necessary, then God is God. If a thing is God, then it is going to be necessary. So jumping into the first one, it's necessary that for all G, so it's necessary that for all X, if X is G, then X has the property of T and X has the property of C. So we're saying that for all X, if X is the greatest conceivable being, then X has the property of being greater than what can be thought, and the property of being a consistent concept. So that's the first one. And second one, GCB cannot be thought of as A, necessarily non-existent, or as B, contingently existing, but only as C, necessarily existing. So the way I parsed it is, it's necessary that for all X, if X is G, then X has the property of N, which is the property of necessarily existing. And then we jump to the next one, number 3. So GCB can only be thought of as the kind of being that cannot not exist, that must exist. And this is the one where it sounds a bit confusing, but it does make sense. So it's necessary that for all X, where X is G, then it is false that E is false, or it is not that not E, if that makes sense. So rather than being E being not true, we're saying it's not true, then E is not true, which means that E is true. And I've probably made that sound a lot more complicated than it really is, but there you go. Number 4, but what must be so is so. And I think this is just more of a commentary, so I didn't parse this one. And conclusion. Therefore, GCB, i.e. God exists, and it's a straightforward one. It's necessary for all x, where x is G, then x has the property of E. This makes sense. So when you turn this into a complete formula, this is what we have, which looks beautiful and just perfect and just lovely. What it reads as, it's necessary that for all x, where x is G, then x has the property of T and x has the property of C. And it's necessary for all x, if x is G, then x has the property of N. And it's necessary for all x, if x has the property of G, then x is not E. Therefore, it's necessary for all x, if x is G, then x has the property of E. Whew, okay, that's a mouthful. So that's the entire formula. I'm of the opinion that this is valid modal predicate logic, and I think most people educated in modal predicate logic will agree. It's pretty straightforward. It's WFF, which is a well-formed formula. But just to kind of get a second opinion, I kind of reached out to ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is actually really good for dealing with logic, and especially logic and philosophy. So I'll simply paste it into ChatGPT and ask if it's valid modal predicate logic. And what ChatGPT does is it took my logic and it did the reverse. So it, rather than me building logic, it broke down logic bit by bit, and it parsed the operators and different variables and predicates to come to a conclusion. The conclusion is, therefore, the provided modal predicate logic formula is indeed valid. So what it means is the entire argument here, it's valid, it's logically valid, which is what I love. So the question mark is whether it's valid and sound. So whether it's sound, I think might be for another video. It's a very complex concept, the idea of the greatest conceivable being. I personally think it's sound as well, just from my own research. I plan to do another video about it. But until we get there, as far as this argument goes, it's completely 100% valid. So well done, Ali Martinez. Good stuff. Okay, bye.